So now that we got started with components and props and how we can build basic React applications, it's time to practice what we learned. And it's of course specifically time to practice working with those components because, as you learned, components are a crucial React concept and the core building block of all those user interfaces you're going to build with React. Therefore, in this course section here, we're going to build this demo application, this very basic website, which will utilize this component concept, or which code will utilize this component concept. And the idea behind this section here is that you can practice what you learned. For that, in this section, you're going to split an existing component, an existing React application, you could say, into smaller components. And you're therefore going to create and use multiple custom components. And you're also going to need to pass data to some of those components. So that's also something you're going to do in this course section. In the next lecture, I'll provide you with a starting project and your main tasks, and thereafter, you should try to complete those tasks on your own. So as mentioned, this is the project, the website we're going to build in this section. And when I say we're going to build it, I basically mean you're going to build it. Or at least you should try building it first. Because I got a couple of tasks for you that allow you to practice what you learned. Though, of course, throughout the rest of this section here, I'm going to build this website here together with you, and you can follow along with me to see how I'm tackling those tasks and how I'm building this project. But that being said, let's now take a look at this starting project I prepared for you and the tasks you should complete with this project. So here's the starting project, and you of course find it attached. You also find a link to Code Sandbox attached, which you can use alternatively if you don't want to install anything locally. But I'm of course going to use a local environment, as I always do in this course. And in this starting project I'm providing to you, you'll find a source folder with a couple of JavaScript files and an assets folder with a nested images folder. Now, the only really relevant file for us is the app.js file. In that file here, you'll already find some code, and you'll also already find a React component in there. Now, this component and this overall app is not finished though. Instead, here in this component, I got a header where I output an image, and the image is actually imported like this from the assets folder. This is an import syntax you can use in React projects. It is supported by the underlying development server and build process. And this is how you can use images, which are stored in this assets images folder here, in your component files. You simply import them, assign any name of your choice to them, and then you use them as a dynamic source value. But that's already in this file, of course. What's not in this file, or what's at least not finished right now, is information about some of those React key concepts you should be aware of, though I will say that this is just a demo website, just an exercise, and this is not an exhaustive list of all key React concepts. Instead, you're going to learn about more React concepts throughout this course. But anyways, here we got an array full of objects, and down here the goal is to output the information that's contained in those objects in this array, but at the moment that's not happening. And that's where your tasks start. The first task is to output those key concepts, so that key concepts data. This data, which you find in this array, should be output here on the screen. And of course, with that, I don't mean that you should copy and paste the text. Instead, you should find a different way of outputting that data. But that's only the first task. The second task then is to identify possible components you could create. possible JSX code snippets you could outsource into a separate component. For that, you should analyze this JSX code in the app component and come up with possible components this code could be split up into. Now, of course, identifying possible components isn't everything, though. Instead, then, as a last task in this section here, you should then also create and use those custom components. So you should create new components, also use props if you need to use them. And of course, once you went through all these steps and once you have a working solution, definitely also take a look at the remaining lectures in this section, because there I will walk you through my solution, repeat some core component and React concepts you must know, and of course also let you know why I chose this solution and why I perform certain steps. Now, in case you're getting stuck whilst trying this on your own, also take a look at the next lecture, so the lecture after this one here, because that will be a hints lecture where I give you some hints on how to tackle this and where I therefore can hopefully help you come up with a solution. And with that, good luck, and I'll see you in my solution. So let's now solve these tasks. And for that, of course, we're going to start with the first task, where we output the key concepts data. Now, the data is already here in app.js in this concepts array. And now the goal is to output that data down there. And if you take a look at this unordered list here, where the concept data should be output, you can see that I already got one list item there. But at the moment, it only contains dummy content here, only dummy data. That now needs to be replaced with the actual data from these objects. And as I mentioned, the goal is now not to copy and paste that data, but instead to dynamically access the data in that concepts array. And in React, you can do that by using single curly braces, as you learned. Opening and closing single curly braces. Between those curly braces, you can put any JavaScript expression that yields a value. You could, for example, put 1 plus 1 in here, but of course that's not the goal here. Instead, here for the image, I want to refer to this image, or precisely to the value stored under the image key in this first object in this array. So this value stored under this image key in the first object of this array. To output that image here, we can go to this source here, so between those curly braces, reference this concepts array by its name. And then, since it's an array and I want to access the first element in there, I can use square brackets 0, which does access the first element in that array. And that first element will be this object here. And in this object, I now want to get access to that value that's stored under the key image. So therefore, we can use the dot notation here and access image, like this. And this will output the image here. Now I also want to set the alt text dynamically, and I want to set this to the title of this concept. And therefore here, we again need curly braces to dynamically output some content here. And then we use concepts again, square bracket 0, because we're still working on the same concepts object. And then dot title gives us access to the title. And that's actually also exactly the code I need down here to output the title as text. So between those h2 tags. And then here for the paragraph where I want to output the description, I want to access concepts 0 description. With that, we should be outputting data about the first key concept in that concepts array. Now, to see this in action here on my local machine, I need to start this development server, which in Visual Studio Code can be done by opening a new terminal and running npm start. Though for this to succeed, I first must run npm install to install all those extra dependencies, including that build process that's used behind the scenes. And you only need to do this once, as you learned when you initially set up a project. And thereafter, we can run npm start. And this will now start that development server. And then, once I visit localhost 3000, I can indeed see this key concept here on the screen. It's quite big for me here because I zoomed in quite a bit so that you can see it really well as well. And I got a light hover effect here, but clicking doesn't actually do anything here. It's just a visual effect. But this is now the first key concept being output here. It's not the only key concept we got though. Instead, if we take a look here at this concepts array, we of course got 2 more objects in there. And the goal, of course, is to also output those concepts. And therefore, what we can do for now, and what will change later, is that we copy and paste this list item and now access concepts1 image, concepts1 title, also here, and also concepts1 description. And this will access the second element in this concepts array and then access image, title, and description for that second element. And of course, we can then also repeat this one last time here for the third element, where we therefore access concepts2 image, concepts2 title, also here, and concepts2 description. And with that, we'll be outputting all 3 concepts for the moment, simply by copy and pasting this code, but that of course will change soon. If you saved that though, and you got that development server up and running, you will now see these 3 key concepts on the screen. And that, theoretically, is of course already the final solution. It's the final website we want to build here. But it's not the final solution for those tasks I gave you. It's only the solution for the first task. Because whilst we got a working solution, we don't have the best possible working solution. Instead, the next task is to identify possible components before we then also build and use those components. So let's now take a look at our code and identify possible components into which we could split up the current code. For that, if you take a look at the current code, the current JSX code to be precise, I got at least 2 components into which this could be split up. And that would be the header component, that could be a separate component, and then one reusable component for those key concepts. So this list item could go into its own reusable component. We could also build a third component, this concepts component, but that is optional. You could definitely do it though, I will say that. Now, before we go ahead and build those components, I want to briefly explain why we could split the app into those components I just mentioned. And for that, I first of all want to say that, of course, for a very simple website like this one here, leaving the code like this wouldn't be wrong, wouldn't be horrible. But of course, this is just a basic demo app since we're just getting started with React. And of course, we want to practice those key React concepts you already learned about, like components, for example. And there actually also is a good reason for splitting this up into components. At least a separate component for these concepts makes a lot of sense, because right now, if I ever decide that I want to get rid of this description paragraph, for example, I have to delete this paragraph manually in 3 different places to get rid of it. And whilst this is of course certainly doable, it's unnecessary repetition. And that's something we can typically avoid by using and embracing React components. So therefore, let's now also dive into that last task here, and let's create and use some reusable custom components. Now for that, in that app here, I will start with the header. The header will actually not be reused, but still, putting it into its own component is definitely something we can do here. For that, in that src folder, I'll create a new subfolder named components, which is not a must-do as you learned, but a common convention. And in there, I'll add another subfolder called header. because in that header file, I'll then add a header.js file, which should contain the component code. Now, as you learned, and as you can also see in app.js, a component in React is just a function. A standard JavaScript function which does return JSX code though, and which typically is also named like this, starting with an uppercase character. Therefore, in header.js, we can create a new function, and we can name it header, which is a name that makes sense for a component that contains the header code. Then I also want to export this as a default so that we can use this component outside of this file. And then we can go to app.js and cut this header code here, move it to header.js and return it there. Like this. And if I press the auto formatting shortcut here on my system in Visual Studio Code, this automatically gets formatted like this. Now, of course, I'm using an image here, and therefore, since I cut this header code from the app component file and moved it to header.js, I also need to move this import. So we can also cut this there and move that to header.js, like this. So now we got that import moved over. We got the app.js file cleaned up therefore. But of course now the header component that we're defining in header.js should be used in app.js. And to use it there, we want to add a new import where we import header, though this name here is up to you since it's a default we're importing, but you should start with an uppercase character because, as you learned, those uppercase characters are needed on your own components to differentiate them from built-in components. And we import the header component from /components, so diving into that components folder, then there into the header folder, and then there header. And here in this React project, as you learned, you can and should omit the file extension for those JavaScript files. With that, the header component is being imported, and we can now use it here as a self-closing component like this in the JSX code returned by the app component. It doesn't take any props because it really doesn't need any props. We could make it configurable, but since we're not reusing it, we're not using it anywhere else, there really is no reason to do that, and therefore I'm not accepting any props, I'm not passing any props, and if I save this, it should work, but I am getting an error. I am getting an error that the image can't be found in the end. And this makes sense because since I moved this image import, I also need to check whether the path still is correct, and that's not the case here, because the header component file is actually nested in the components and then there in the header folder. So therefore, this import path should be adjusted, and I should first go up one level so that I'm in the components folder, and then another level with .. so that I'm in the source folder, and then we can dive into the assets folder and then there the images folder and then select this image. So with this, the error now went away, and if I reload this, the header is still there as it was before, but now it was outsourced into a separate component. Next, let's work on these concept components here. So let's now outsource these concept items here into a separate component. And for that, of course, I want to outsource this list item code here in the end into a separate component. For that, in the components folder, we can add another subfolder called concept, though of course this name, as always, is up to you. And then in there, create a concept.js file where I also have my concept function for this concept component, which of course must be exported to make it available outside of this file. And then here, I want to return this list item JSX code. So I can cut it from here, from app.js, and move it here into concept.js. Now, one very important note here. In theory, we could now create 3 different concept components, one for every core concept that we're outputting here. But if we would do that, we would still be duplicating and replicating code. And if we ever wanted to delete the paragraph, we still would have to do that in 3 different components. That's why I'm not building 3 different components here, but instead one reusable component, which must be configurable though. It must be configurable so that one and the same component can output different data. Data that's always output in the same way, so that always has the same shape in the end, but the different data pieces, the image, the title, the description, the values stored under those keys, that will differ. And that's the idea here with this function component. So therefore it must be configurable in order to be reusable. And how do we make it configurable? With help of props. So here we can and should accept this props argument, this props parameter, which will be created and managed automatically by React, and which will be passed into this component function by React. And then with that, here we can, for example, output props.image. And here, props.title. And here it's also props.title, and the same is true here for description. It's props.description. And with that, we made this component configurable, and it does now accept an image, a title, and a description key, which can and should be set when that component is being used in JSX code. Therefore, now back in app.js, we can use this concept component here, and for it to be usable here, we also must import it. So here we should import concept from /components concept. And with that import here added, we can go down, use the concept component like this as a self-closing component here, because I'm not passing anything between its opening and closing tabs. And then here we can set the image prop like this, because in concept I'm extracting an image prop. So I'm looking for this key, hence we should provide it here on this component, and set this to concepts 0 image. So we're still accessing that concepts data from this array, but we're now passing it to our own custom component. And of course, we're now going to do the same for the title. Here we should access concepts 0.title. And last but not least, we also want to do that for the description, of course, and pass concepts 0.description as a value for the description prop. With that, if I formatted this, the code looks like this. And now we can easily replace those list items here with our own custom component and pass the correct data to the props. So here for concepts 1 on that second item, and on the third item for concepts 2, so for the third concepts item. And with that, we now got this reusable component, and we are reusing it, and we are configuring it with help of props. And the HTML structure is now only defined once inside of this component, but it can now easily be reused thanks to our custom component. And I make sure that here I'm accessing concepts 2, not concepts 3, which would be wrong. And I save this again. I now got the same website as before with those key concepts items, but now we're building it with help of custom components, custom reusable components, and therefore all 3 tasks that I gave you at the beginning of this section are now solved.